Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Ely, and on behalf of the Children, Youth, and Families at Risk Professional Development and Technical Assistance Center, thank you for joining our webinar. It is my pleasure to present today's speaker. Dr. Pilar Gaithier, representing the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, is an Indigenous psychologist and licensed professional counselor whose work centers Indigenous ways of knowing and doing as legitimate sources of knowledge and scientific inquiry within academia and systems. Her research practices, which represent Menominee tribal sovereignty and linguistic and cultural intellectual property, testify to her commitment to her community. As a result, her research approach has been formally reviewed and endorsed by her tribe's legislative body. Pilar's research and evaluation methods emphasize the intersection of psychology and environmental relationships, including the history and role of racism, sexism, economic structures, and exploitation in Western research and institutions to improve psychological practices among underrepresented communities in the context of global and earth wellness. Pilar is currently the Vice President of Medicine Fish Corps, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering tribal youth through healing, building, and inspiring. She was awarded a 2-year research postdoc with LOCA Initiative out of the Center for Healthy Living or Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she explores emotional experiences of climate and environmental crisis. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Pilar.
Thank you for that introduction, Philip. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. So let me go in there. So Poso Natanaway Makanuk, Pilar Gauthier New Wiswan, Nonet, Ted Gauthier Jr. Awe, Mashik Nakia, Doreen Gauthier Awe, Namaso, Sapatis Awe, Cotnap, Mashik Nokomad, Nape Awe, Cotnap, Netnu Nikitsak, Saswan Jacoby, Mashik Mayan Owiswan, Mashik Nikut Natan, Anikosa Owiswan, Ometnomene, Kayas Mamache Tawak, Ometnomene, Natewim, Natachaiko. So I said greetings, my relatives. My English name is Pilar. I also introduced my family, my parents and my grandparents. My grandparents who are now passed. I also introduced my children. I have 3 sons and 1 daughter. And just want you to know that I come from people of Wild Rice, and we are the movers. And yeah, I'm Menominee in my spirit. So today I just really want to show appreciation for Philip for gathering you all and helping me to share a bit about what I understand to be Native American mental health. So thank you again, Philip, for that introduction. And I just also want to share that this presentation here that I'm going to share with you is built on my experiences growing up in a tribal community on the Menominee Indian Reservation, as well as my career experiences as a mental health practitioner for the past 15 years. Additionally, as a community member, as a mother, and as a daughter, the lessons that I learned and how I come to understand mental health and wellness, they're all woven into the content that I will share with you all today and built on those identities that I hold. So the way I set this up is through storytelling. And all stories, as we know, have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And usually those endings are only temporary and picked up by another storyteller who is connecting and continuing some kind of journey or message as it evolves and grows. And so in that spirit, I'm going to begin this story about Native American wellness by introducing or reminding us about the way our mental well-being as Indigenous people were changed and transformed by United States influence. So I'm also then going to share about what's currently measured as mental health, specifically through outcomes and data such as disparities. And then together we're going to situate that history toward building a new and hopefully a healthier understanding of well-being for both individuals and communities, but also systems as well. So I hope that what you get out of this is a basic understanding of Indigenous-centered approaches, including understanding a historical context that has led to present-day implications of the disparities that you'll hear about today. I also want you to walk away with a new paradigm, a new philosophy for a wellness approach. And so we can do some comparing and contrasting the different mental health approaches, specifically between Western and Indigenous paradigms. And then I want to end with this message that I hope you all have tools and resources along with new knowledge to allow you to take personal responsibility toward an approach that aligns and centers the voices of tribal people, and also allows them to feel empowered about, their own understanding of health and well-being and the role that you can play in that too. So I just want to start off with some kind of key data points and definitions to ground the work. So here in this presentation, I'm going to refer to Indigenous people as Native American people because that's often the term that's used in the literature. And we're talking about folks who live in the United States. So the term Indigenous itself is a very inclusive term. It encompasses those who share cultural or racial identity, but it does not hold the legal context of American Indians, which relates to federal law. So for this presentation, I'll use Indigenous and Native interchangeably, but when I'm talking about data, I'll use Native American or sometimes American Indian, Alaska Native. And so again, just wanting to reiterate not only that history that mental health disparities are rooted in, but that because of that history, there's a general lack of trust in relationship with the United States, and that therefore leads to inaccurate data, which we'll get into some of those issues shortly. So just some key information here: 575 federally recognized sovereign tribes in the United States, expanding with the 100 state recognized tribes. So just the Census Bureau, most recent 2020, puts us at about 3% of the total U.S. population, as you can see there. So not much in context. In terms of some disparities, some differences, we're looking at a couple of different data points here. So in 2019, the educational attainment rates essentially show that Natives have different types of diplomas, but in parentheses here, you see that first bullet, 84.4% who have a high school diploma as compared to 93.3% of white non-Hispanic counterpoints. So you can look through those bullets and see how there's that disparity there where 20.8 have at least a bachelor's degree compared to 36.9, 7.6 having an advanced graduate or professional degree compared to 13.9, so just roughly about half. And then there's some data there about household income, where you see that the average or median household income in 2019 was under $50,000 compared to 71,664, again, for median white non-Hispanic individual. And then you have those differences in poverty level, 7.9 living at a poverty level compared to 3.7. I'm sorry, that's 20.3 compared to 9% living at the poverty level, and then 7.9% unemployment compared to 3.7. So those are some pretty alarming data points there. And I don't like to have to present on that stuff because I think there's so much more, and I'll get to this later about how it is that we do measure wellness. But this is unfortunately the way the United States federal government measures wellness and well-being, and it's often economically driven. And so I want to talk about that stuff and think through with you all ways that we can not only recontextualize wellness despite these disparities, but also think about the barriers that are causing and contributing to them as well. So here, again, just a little bit more about health disparities in general. I want to talk about healthcare coverage because health in general have some major implications for tribal people. You can see here 14.9% of Native Americans lack healthcare coverage. And although Indian Health Services do provide care to a great number of Native people, 42% of the total Native population, and in that improving since the passing of the ACA, you're still having disparities in life expectancy rates where women are dying at a faster rate or sooner than again white non-Hispanic women, and then the same is true for men. So when we think about Indian Health Services providing just under half of the healthcare, or servicing just under half of Native people in the United States, there's still important barriers there, namely geographic isolation, which isn't just an issue for accessing care, but it's also an issue for recruiting and retaining providers. And then the Indian Health Services, which is a federal program, is pretty chronically underfunded as well. So in terms of how it is that these disparities then contribute to health outcomes within Native American communities, we see leading diseases and causes of death, including heart disease, cancer, unintentional injuries, especially diabetes, but also stroke. You see heightened risk factors for mental health, suicide, teenage pregnancy, liver disease, hepatitis. Native people tend to be overrepresented in alcohol mortality rates, and then suicide rates are twice the general US population. And then especially among teenagers being 2.5 times likely to complete suicide than any other group. So these health disparities are contributing to some pretty significant population impacts. If we look a little bit closer in terms of mental health, we see disproportionately high rates of lifetime substance abuse, suicide, violence, anxiety, and affective disorders. And again, those are corroborated and linked to high rates of violence and poverty. So you see higher mental health disparities, particularly within communities, Indigenous communities, but you also see intergenerational and ongoing trauma, which are creating even more complexity for how it is that we can address these disparities. And so what we have to understand is, how did we get here? Native people didn't have these kind of experiences pre-colonization, and so we start at the beginning with colonization. So colonization, I'm going to share this information as if is brand new, and if you have any questions about that, I welcome them. So colonization resulted in the genocide, the loss of culture, loss of cultural knowledge, traditions, land, and identity among Native people. And from colonization then ensued the mental, physical, and social impact on health that we just saw, and that is cumulative over time. So historical trauma specifically stems from hundreds of years of war, disease, genocide, forced removal from land, forced separation from families, forced integration into mainstream society. And that trauma then that's associated with colonization was the synthesis of historical oppression and ongoing cultural, spiritual, and psychological disruption. Approximately what we say is that colonization introduced never before experiences of oppression, discrimination, and resource scarcity. And that's why we see present day forms of complex trauma and deep poverty. So Native American scholars and leaders, they recognize, in addition, that government sanctioned boarding schools that sequestered children were a root cause of what we see as the contemporary and persistent mental health issues. So you have post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance abuse, and suicide that are proliferating in Native American communities. So we'll talk just specifically a bit more about colonization here, where the latter part, so colonization from the 1700s to the 1800s, the latter part of the 1700s, that was a time of a lot of war and genocide. So you have a couple of big examples here, the Sand Creek Massacre, which demonstrated just how inhumane and undignified the U.S. military war tactics were, where it wasn't just fighting fairly between leaders of communities and the men of communities, but this is where you saw complete humiliation and degradation of Native men, women, and children who in the name of gaining control of land and Native communities. You also had the 1860s, the gold rush. And so they talk about Sunday shoots where white people would literally massacre entire tribal villages in order to procure land in the search for gold. So these were some of the violent acts that were intended by federal policy to eradicate Native American people. And as a result of these acts, it ushered in the assimilation period. So assimilation took place between the 1800s and the 1900s. And it was largely a religious project early on in the stages, where there were many political tactics involved there. So at this time, you have major policies such as the Dawes Act, which was meant to mostly meant for land seizure, so assimilate Native people in a mainstream American society through the project of land seizure and ownership. And then also federal Indian policy, which is related to the boarding school era. At the same time, you have this rise of the mythic narratives of Native people through savage imagery, meant to create the sentiment across the United States that Native people were barbaric, and so removing them from lands and sequestering children into the boarding schools was then viewed as a good thing, because then we have our pathway into capitalism, we have our pathway into industrialization and manifest destiny in the future of America. And so this is an actual depiction of a poster that was used as a way to show people not only that this made sense, you know, and it was attainable to get land, but it also again sort of plays into that narrative of savage natives getting in the way otherwise of land possession. And so this began a twofold approach for white Americans then to acquire more Indian land. So as a result of those series of events, including the Dawes Act, by 1955, the Native American natural land base dwindled to approximately 2.3% of its original size. And you can see here this quote by President Jefferson in 1803, where he says, "To promote this disposition to exchange lands which they have to spare and we want, for necessaries which we have to spare and they want, we shall push our trading houses and be glad to see the goods and influential individuals among them run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what the individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by a cessation of land." Um, and so essentially wanting to start trading and bartering with tribal people, or not trading and bartering, but actually to want to do marketing with tribal people in hopes of driving Native people into debt, because when they would drive their communities in the debt through cutting them off access to natural resources, that would force individuals and communities to then sell their land off in order to survive. So here then we move into that second policy, which is federal Indian education policy. So again, that twofold approach, land sequestration and then the sequestration of children. So federal Indian policy was specifically US Congress driven to enlist Christian missionaries who were available at the time to enact assimilation policies through the Project of Religion. And so US Congress allocated funding in order to develop these schools. So the boarding school period lasted between 1801 and 1969 with the focus of assimilation of Native American culture into Americanism. And so you have a picture here of General Richard Pratt, who himself is a military man and a Methodist. This is a very common quote that we hear: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Sometimes people say, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And General Pratt said it would take him no more than 500 boarding schools to get rid of this Indian problem. And to that point, by 1969, there were more than 400 boarding schools across the United States. The Miriam Report was an investigation which in 1928 that looked into some of the issues that were starting to surface about the boarding schools. And what the Miriam Report did was it did indeed expose issues including a lack of food, overcrowding, physical abuse, and health conditions. In addition to forced labor, which children were being forced into farm work and other types of servitude in order to meet funding gaps in the schools, and of course, harsh punishments. The Miriam Report also cited, I can't remember if it's in the next slide or not, but also cited the fact that for the first time, families were being separated, broken up, and that these kinship systems were being broken, and sort of pushed back against federal Indian policy by saying, you know, the point was to help these Native people, and in fact, we're doing more harm than good, and we're also harming families. So an interesting report to come out for the time. However, it didn't do much to eradicate boarding schools. And so again, sort of to reinforce that last slide there, you see oppression, discrimination, resource scarcity, and what we now see is complex trauma and deep poverty. So boarding school periods specifically are cited to have paved the way for the health disparities that we see today, not only through the spread of disease and high rates of death by disease, but also the first documented incidences of broken homes and marital discord, where for the first time ever you have single mother homes. It also then, it contributed to the general erosion of families and the general erosion of kinship networks. It also led to the first ever reported victimization of Native girls and women, specifically by white men. So getting into mental health implications, you see a very clear social pathology between colonization, which we call that intergenerational transmission of trauma and stress. And that intergenerational transmission through epigenetics, where you see homelessness, deep poverty, substance abuse, suicide, economic disparity, mental health disparity, whereas we saw earlier in the presentations, Native American people are disproportionately represented as having those outcomes. Since understanding and having a sort of shift in discourse about those disparities through understanding the boarding school period and colonization and that pathway, Native people have been pretty active in fighting to reestablish sovereignty and oversight of their communities, particularly in health, physical, mental health, as well as their own school systems. And of course, there's often calls for apologies and reconciliation by the federal government. And I know President Biden, or former President President Biden, forgetting today's election day. President Biden just gave an apology, I think a couple weeks ago, which I think a lot of people were really happy about. But again, of course, then what comes next? And that's where people are looking at reconciliation. And then, of course, always looking to the Vatican to take responsibility for those inhumane acts and that genocide of Native children, especially. And so here, this isn't to say that there isn't ongoing contemporary forms of colonization and systemic discrimination, that while the boarding school period has ended, and federal policy has shifted a little bit, and we still see systemic discrimination. And we see systemic discrimination and racial discrimination, specifically despite socioeconomic status. So when controlling for geographic location or neighborhood, Native Americans tend to experience higher rates of racism and interpersonal violence, including racial slurs and microaggressions. Additionally, you see disproportionate rates of criminalization and imprisonment, specifically because of stereotyping, which are linked attributions to people and held by prosecutors, judges, and general criminal justice personnel. So we see disproportionately high incarceration rates for Native American people. And then relatedly, you see resistance and discrimination about Native people's identity, including having problems with Native people, having long hair, carrying cultural significant items, including regalia, which we see happen in schools quite often. So just the point of intersectionality here. U.S. economic structure is a very important part of mental health, where tribal economics are implicated in some of these disparities, specifically when we look at how it is that communities are assessed for their well-being. I mentioned earlier that I don't really like to have to talk about and highlight some of those data points about the disparities, but unfortunately, that is the way state governments and the federal government assess for community well-being. And so what we want to do here is we want to situate the health and social factors of tribes within the context of economic barriers, as they are linked to the contribution and exacerbation of problems because of colonization and assimilation. So specifically, globalization of financial power, that's not something that tribal people are going to kind of start conversations off at. But in fact, that accumulation of power, that is what leads to class divides. And it also then contributes to ongoing inequality and ongoing exploitation, which tribes tend to face the harshest consequences for. So if you remember earlier in the presentation, I talked about geographic isolation. Many tribes were forced onto reservations, which were geographically located far from the capital. And so that's intentional, far from the capital being both sometimes the metropolis of the state, the cities, but also the capital as it's relating to capitalism. And because of that, you have deep poverty, which deep poverty, different than poverty, assumes that it's going to take generations to climb out of. Along with that, there's a lot of psychological implications. General suffering. You have introduced different work factors, where now tribes are facing competitive work culture. Within work culture, you have toxic racism, sexism, an emphasis on production over human environmental well-being. And these also in the workplace lead to long-term health outcomes. It leads to class division, poverty, lack of employment opportunities, lack of employment benefits, and just in general increased rates of underemployment or unemployment. All this is to say is that tribes face an uphill battle on all fronts. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the effects of violence. So Native American women and femme-identifying individuals experience many forms of violence, which place them at higher risk of homicide, degradation, mental health, substance abuse. 1 in 30 children experience child abuse. 1/3 of Native American women have experienced sexual violence. And that leads to high rates of suicide among those who are impacted. And again, these are reinforced by ongoing systemic discrimination, including stereotypes, objectification, mascots, sexism, as well as victim blaming, not only by perpetrators, but also the system itself because of these objectifications. A little bit more information on mental health. So as reiterated earlier, substance misuse, you see higher rates in some communities, but there is variety across tribes. So there's been a long-held stereotype that every tribe experience high rates of alcoholism, but in fact, what we see is that while some communities may have higher mortality rates related to alcohol-induced death or just higher rates of substance misuse, some communities see very little. So other things there, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder has not only been linked to combat experiences where Native Americans tend to represent the highest enlisted service per capita, but so you have higher rates of combat experiences per capita, in addition to the interpersonal violence that I had talked about earlier, which are a result of living in a deep and minoritized, marginalized community. Of course, high rates of suicide, 9th leading cause of death across all ages for Native Americans, and then the 2nd leading cause of death for youth between 15 to 24. I mean, those are higher than any other racial or ethnic groups. So when we're thinking about suicide and trying to figure out points of intervention, we're looking at past attempts of suicide, exposure to domestic violence, trauma, access to firearms, general hopelessness and impulsivity, and a general lack of support, among others. And just for those of you who aren't familiar, post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a mental health disorder, a diagnosable mental health disorder that arises when a person has been exposed to or experienced a frightening, shocking, or dangerous event. Interesting for post-traumatic stress disorder, I always tell people that 2 people can see the same event, and one person could develop post-traumatic stress disorder while the other person can walk away relatively okay. So just being exposed or having experienced a traumatic event doesn't mean that you develop the symptoms that would then result in a diagnosis such as post-traumatic stress disorder. So now we have the disparities, we have the history that helps us to understand the context of these disparities, and particularly economic and mental health, social. So what are the challenges then for accessing support? So that would be the next phase is, well, what can we do about it? Well, truth be told, a lot has been tried, but there have been a lot of challenges for Native people to access care and support. One of the biggest reason that I have found, being a barrier is specifically the biomedical model that's endorsed by United States Mental Health, which follows a deficit and disease-based model. And so you have people who are getting help, but they need a diagnosis, which is sort of like historical gaslighting, because as a practitioner myself, sitting down and diagnosing someone based on their symptoms today, their challenges, their struggles, and it usually means asking them, what are they doing that is contributing, or what are they not doing, which really means how are you hurting yourself. So I say historical gaslighting because we're not using that whole history of colonization and assimilation, which is actually rooted in all of these symptoms that are being presented. So you have individuals then walking away from United States healthcare feeling shame that they're letting themselves down, their family down, and particularly then not wanting to return. So you have a high dropout rate in those kind of services, which then leads to internalization of themselves in context of their struggle. So some real ramifications on identity and wellness. And then you also have United States mental health, and as well as medical physical health models who emphasize individual wellness versus wellness in the context of community and land and environment. And so related to that, you have evidence-based treatments, which are pushed, particularly in managed care organizations, and they don't tend to include Native Americans when they're building their effectiveness studies. And so when they're then being applied to tribal people, they already feel foreign and they don't feel good because they're again taking that deficit-based model on one person versus considering the impact against the whole community and family. So you have what's called traits of psychological mindedness, which are the way I was trained in mental health and psychology, where you have one person in your office and the goal of psychology or psychotherapy is introspection. So you're asking this person to introspect, and then from introspection and self-awareness, asking them to be self-directed, focus on your own wellness, your own self-care, and what is your personal story? And again, what is your personal success story at the end of this treatment? And that those traits are not in alignment with the way Native American people see themselves in context of their family, community, and their place that they live. So shifting a little bit to community, to social norms and mores, we want to see continuity across Native American people, who they are, and their community. So what we say is, instead of saying that they have a disorder, what I hear a lot in my community is we say they're lost and we need to help them find themselves. And the assumption is all of that history is what contributed to that, not the person themselves getting themselves lost or finding themselves in distress, but we have an understanding that all of that history has accumulated and played a role in that. And it's the community's role and responsibility through ceremony and spiritual practice to help them find themselves. So that's done through ceremony, through love, through compassion, full acceptance. And so people will often say we give of ourselves for the healing of our community members, and we give of ourselves for their well-being, and that through doing that, time is not an issue. This is the opposite of egocentrism or focus on self, right? It's saying that we're all moving together. And so for Native American people, particularly those who grow up in their tribal community, their identity and their roles are tied to their family. And they want that purpose. They want to have that responsibility. And if these symptoms that are being attributed to X, Y, and Z historical policy and factor are getting in the way of them doing what it is that drives their purpose, then the Native communities are trying to figure out what is a preferred healing approach. Today, I'm sharing with you that preferred healing approach tend to be through community healers, extended family networks, and ceremonies. Those are usually seasonal and place-based. You can see already that if you walk into a clinic, those clinics are doing the same thing every day, 5 days a week. Doesn't matter the season, time of the year, doesn't matter who the person is. It's pretty cookie cutter. So this preferred healing approach that tribal people tend to take on is fundamentally different. And this is the introduction then of the paradigm shift. So specifically prioritizing elders as sources of knowledge, tradition, not only community cultural tradition, but also family tradition, prayer, ceremony. So people tend to find themselves, but through reconnecting to community and cultural practices. So finding of themselves in the context of others that they care for. So just some more elements that I find helpful when thinking about healing for Native people. So again, rooted in traditional practices, but additionally, these practices are incredibly empowering. So ceremony is an opportunity for an individual who is in need of healing or finding of themselves, because they not only learn or relearn how to receive and accept and internalize love and compassion, but they actually demonstrate their own strength through overcoming within self-sacrifice. So we have purification or fasting ceremonies for people where they make these self-sacrifices and then come out at the end to people who are there waiting for them and celebrating them. And so they come out of that finding internal sources of strength, but also commitment and more meaningful role for themselves in the context of their families. And so you hear families say no one's not alone, and this really shows how work is done in a good way. So there's plenty of examples outside of tradition, outside of ceremony or spirituality, of incredibly innovative, culturally rooted healing models that exist across tribes. There's like the healing of the canoe journey out in Suquamish, Coast Salish country. As shared in my bio, am a part of a nonprofit working on healing through our medicine fish model. I mean, there's countless others, but I want to caution that those do also give false hope to practitioners who are specifically looking to grab onto something for themselves to do with the communities that they're working with. And I want to say, while there's those great examples, they're also context-based. They're tribal. There's a tribal context, in a cultural and spiritual context, in a land context. And so instead of say like, here's all these examples, explore them and pick one that you think will work, what I would invite instead today is another approach, which contain the elements of healing for Native people, but I believe lead to meaningful interconnectedness between tribal and non-tribal allies. So this is an example of the mental health paradigm, which is what I've been trained up in for the past 15 years, sort of figuring my way through. Where the approach is treating mental health conditions. So we're treating mental health through drugs, through psychotherapy, but also through different herbal kind of remedies, surgery, acupuncture. But essentially, the paradigm is to treat the mental health condition as a disease, and the goal is to have an absence of symptoms, so to feel better. So a lot of what I do is in a research context. And so while this may not neatly apply, it is the example that I want to use just to show a paradigm shift. So a paradigm is a set of beliefs about the world and how it is that we gain knowledge that guide our actions, and then how it is that we go about doing our work, doing research, doing our mental health practitioner work, doing our teaching work. The example that I want to share here is Ometno Manewak Mano Pamatasakan. That's Menominee, and that means a good way of life, essentially. And that can shift depending on how it is being used. Right now, I'm saying that it is the Menominee good way of life. So it describes a way of being and beliefs about the world, which is our ontology, and then it guides how we think about the world, which is our epistemology. And you can see from this picture, it's our self in context of all these other pieces. So if we move a little bit deeper into that paradigm, then what that's essentially telling me is that these Menominee ways of thinking then set forth and guide me for how it is that I or we as Indigenous people interact with and gain knowledge about the world. That is our methodology. So as practitioners working with individuals who may be experiencing mental health, how does our methodology, our intervention, how are they informed then by our way of thinking about the world, interacting with the world, learning about the world? So it really holds our ethical standards and morals. And this specifically, this axiology, this ethical stance that we take is what sets us apart from US mental health paradigm, because this is the piece that ensures, am I being helpful? Am I being purposeful? Not to me, not just to this individual, but also to their family, to their community, to my family, and to my community. And so contemporarily, you have indigenous epistemologies then that exist, which we can use to center voices and ways of knowing in all the work that we do. So we can say now, through this lens, we can understand how our realities are socially, historically, and culturally constructed. Every single person's reality is nuanced. Their truth is nuanced. So now we talk about that cookie cutter service model. Now we can see how each individual is met with as an individual, but treated in the context of their family, community, and culture. So for you all, for all of us working within tribes, working with tribal people, or maybe in some ancillary role where we have access and exposure, there's implications for us, specifically that of cultural humility. And this is a continuous process. This never stops. So for those of you who say, I'm a lifelong learner, here's one way to continuously be a lifelong learner: through self-reflection, through self-critique, where we take responsibility for examining our own biases, our own cultural perspective, which now, as a result of this presentation, has hopefully broadened somewhat in the context of US colonization and assimilation, because we want to then understand, respect the perspectives that are coming from tribal people, including their beliefs, values. And we want to acknowledge specifically, as people working within systems, as non-tribal people, as white people, white allies, even me as an Indigenous person with a PhD in psychology, having power that creates imbalance when working with people from community, and that we commit to recognizing the nuances of the power and positionalities that we hold, so that we can commit to building equitable relationships with communities from diverse backgrounds, and that this isn't about cultural competency, but continued openness and continued willingness and humility to learn from others. So I want to introduce at the end of this presentation a healing model. This healing model is land and place based, as I said, but it starts with all of us here today, inward. So it starts with our own inward reflection. So this is a departure from typical healing models, which would say, here is this intervention. It's rooted in culture and spirituality, and it's been really effective with tribes. Here's the handbook for it, here's a website for it, and here's like a training opportunity to learn it. What I would argue is that if we want to do effective work with tribal people, it starts with us first. It starts from within. So we have to acknowledge and understand not only the historical transgressions that reinforce trauma by understanding the history, not only US history, state history, but that tribe-specific history. If it's multiple tribes, understanding regional history, what did those tribes go through? Because a lot of those tensions still exist within those tribal experiences in cities and in rural areas. So then we ground that cultural context, and we can then make meaningful connections to community, because we're learning now not only about our own humility to mitigate mistreatment that are continuously happening to Native people in that context of colonization, but we're also then now able to apply that to the current sociocultural context of the communities we work with. So we step outside our offices to do that. We engage in community events. We engage in social activism. And the point of that is to help influence change that protects and uplifts Native voices through healing, through policy and practice, while being continuously aware of the power dynamics that exist, being aware of when we're speaking, when we should speak versus when we should let others speak, and always looking for that ongoing growth inside, catching our assumptions, maintaining curiosity about the wisdom that Native people hold. So this is a cyclical process. This isn't linear. This is cyclical and ongoing. So here is a pictorial of that model. And I use this, I contextualize this seasonally because my community is a very seasonal community. And so we start with our spring season, which is the rebirthing. Things are waking, things are coming alive. And for you all, for me, for all of us here, that's our self-awareness, that deepened self-awareness, that reflection. So now I understand this history that I didn't quite know in depth before. What does that mean for me, for my successes, for my power, for my social location? I mean, the point of that is that we all want belongingness. We all want to belong. And in order for you to have belonging into the Native networks that you're working and trying to contribute to, and for Native people to feel belongingness when they enter into your systems and your programs, we have to have that deep awareness because that is where belongingness is, belongingness within ourselves, and then belongingness and connection to the people we're around. Once that happens, it leads to growth and healing. And that's where we can then hold space for difficult discourse. We share, we learn together, we talk about things that are challenging. And through that, we're respecting Indigenous voices because, of course, cultural humility is telling us to do so. That's where change happens. So between that spring to summer season, where summer season is a time for active activity, learning, being out in community, it's a time where families harvest and play, do community events. That's where we're holding those spaces of learning and sharing. And through learning and sharing about each other and our similarities rather than our divisions, we're inspiring change. So in that autumn season, where we're able to think about the work that needs to be done, there's change happening. Autumn is the time of changing leaves, right? That's where you see trust, co-creation, and that shift in power. So that's where meaningful action happens. That's where meaningful change happens. I came up with this model because too often I see people see health disparities, people are concerned and care, and right away want to jump over to policy change, program change, new programs, innovative models, without first starting at that inner healing and then that sharing and learning in community. And so I would argue that these two pieces have to come before, and then you'll see incredible action and change because it's coming between people, it's being co-created. From there, we move into our winter season, which our winter season represents a time of reflection. So in that summer season, we're contextualizing culture and spirituality, which require us to look into tribal context, look into their customs and practices. When we move into that winter season, we're reflecting on all that we've done and all that we know, and we're wondering what insights do we have that can further strengthen this vision of health. And then that takes us right back through reciprocity and back into a new and deeper reconnection to self, reconnection to community, and rebirthing of kinship, not only with ourselves as allies, but with the communities that we work with. So this is where we have the index for well-being, which is, as you can see, a paradigm shift from the US mental health model, where we have a belief that Native communities understand their social interests. They have a sense of community that starts inward and it's shared through kinship. And it extends into broader society and it can contribute to broader society beyond tribal communities. And tribal people, again, moving from egocentrism, see themselves in their own healing, not as a benefit to them, but as a benefit to their community. So when I'm well, my family can be well, my community can be well. And that then drives purpose. I was just shared this story, and I'm not going to say it nearly as eloquent as it was given to me. But this here is a flatline EKG, right? So what this represents is one's emotion. So if the US mental health model says that we service this individual in the hopes of reducing symptoms toward maybe happiness. So if one is only happy, that's a flat model. That's a flat EKG. So one person might say, if I'm happy all of the time, that's a really good thing. But if you look at that, it's flat. When you compare that to this EKG, you see there's a lot of ups and downs there. So people's natural emotions, the moving through different emotional states, not only signals that someone can experience a range of emotions, but they live a range of life experiences, but it also signifies that they're alive. I just thought that was beautiful and wanted to share that with you all. And that completes my presentation. We do have about 6 minutes for questions, discussion.
And if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat, the Q&A, or you can either raise your hand and I can give you speaking permission so that you can speak openly and directly. And while you're thinking about those questions, I just want to bring up or ask a question that came to my mind. I see
Mhm.
a lot of intersectionality with a lot of other people, and then one of the things that really came to mind was just thinking about just the time that it really takes to change. Because, like you said, it's generational trauma, so it's going to take generations to overcome. Do you
Mhm.
see a lot of instances where people don't understand that it takes that time?
Systems are inherently outcomes driven. And when a system is outcomes driven, we write our goals, our grants, our objectives around meeting a certain endpoint. What I find is that because our systems think that way, and that's bureaucratic and that's capitalistic, saying, I'm going to reach 200 people this year through my program, then we become narrow minded and tunnel visioned on just that. So we're just looking at just meeting that. What that means is that we're actually not seeing everything else, then all the other possibilities. That's where time really slows us down then. When we are able to break away from that way of thinking, we can open our minds to different ways of healing and helping. And when we're able to do that, you can see that you can be pretty effective pretty quickly. It is a paradigm shift, however, transforming entire systems. I mean, I think that the more people who engage in discourse such as this, the more likely we are to see change in within the next couple of generations. I think about the nonprofit that I work with. We're totally and completely outside institutions. We're a nonprofit that's totally our own. We oversee ourselves. And because of that, we can be pretty picky about who we bring on to help support us. And we can turn away system program money, things like that, that we know are going to slow us down. So our program goals are not then directed by those objectives. They're directed by our cultural context, our spiritual context. And because of that, I have seen change shift a lot faster. But of course, that's not the systems that most of us are working in. So yep, time is an issue. And I think time is worth it. So building relationships in community, as much time as that takes, I think that does speed things up at the end of it, because when people trust, people will work together and things can happen quicker.
Awesome. I see Shar had her hand up. So Shar, if you want to go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Yes, Philip, good to see you. Um, Pilar, I could have listened to you all day, so thank you. The way that you did was very inclusive and not judgmental, and no one feels bad for experiencing their trauma. Um, One of the things that I would like to ask you is, how do you help us understand when we can't even name the trauma that we're experiencing? And then for you, Philip, I hope that this is a series. It needs to be turned into a series. Okay. So that's it.
Shar, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your how it is that you're taking this in. I never want people to feel, especially non-native allies, to feel guilty for the atrocities of their ancestors. I don't think that's productive, and that's not guidance that my grandma or my ancestors or relatives would ever give me, to go out and create divisions. And so I'm really glad that that spirit of inclusivity came out there. And as far as our own trauma, so in that spring season, that rebirthing season, that's the time of awareness. We don't need to have names necessarily for our experiences, but we should talk together. We should reflect on that and talk together. So in that spring season is a time to just start speaking out. This is what I'm going through. How has that been for you? One of the questions that I ask practitioners, providers, educators is, why are you doing this work? really, why are you doing it? And I don't want those institutional because I want to see kids graduate. I do this because I love humanity. I love living on this earth. I love my community. That's why I do this work. And so when we think about then what gets in the way of us doing that in the way that we would like to do that in a way that feels good and purpose driven, that's where we can start figuring out what are we going through that's causing harm to us as people. So through dialogue is where we can have shared experiences. So my research is sort of an example of that, where Native women in my research came together. No one ever talks about how Native women are doing, ever. We're strong women, we're strong. I know it's probably the same in other communities, the Black community. Black women are strong. But do people ask those women, how are you doing handling all this that you're doing? And simply through having those dialogues, we're realizing, I didn't know we were going through that. We can name that. I didn't know that dynamic existed. We can name that. Once we can name those things through dialogue, through trust building, through talking openly, we can name those dynamics. We can relate to each other. Now we have a community of people, and now we can say, what can we do about that? How can we build on what we know as health, because these things are out there now? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does answer the question. And without, I mean, Philip knows me, so it is what it is, but without divulging too much of my family history, um, I tell so many people missing and indigenous women always existed. We just didn't have a name for it.
Right.
And so, you know,
Mhm.
thank you for the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Shar, for your question and for your care and commitment to the work that you're doing as well.
Thank you to all of you all. And again, thank you, Dr. Gaithier, for your presentation today.